Wake up, we're here. So much worse than we feared. There's nothing left here. Our country has disappeared. The winter trees.
Well, here we are in day 11, I believe, of Donald J. Trump's presidency. It's been about 10 full days since he was sworn in as the 45th president of the United States of America. It feels like it was about 10 years ago since the new press secretary, Sean Spicer, he came barging out in his first press conference and excoriated the media over the unfair coverage of the inaugural address, which he claimed absolutely showed that more people watched the inaugural address in person and on television than any other in history. That was, of course, demonstrably false, as he was standing there excoriating the media for making false claims. But that just seems like a long time ago now. It was only about 10 days ago, though, 10 or 11 days. That's all. Feels like 10 years. So what does all this portend, though? What is this, the first 10 days? If we take Donald Trump's first 10 days in office and we try to extrapolate into 4 years, that's a scary thought. We try to extrapolate into 4 years. What does it look like? Well, as you can probably tell in the first minute here that I myself had a lot of skepticism over the wisdom of making Donald Trump president of the United States and the most powerful man in the world. But certainly he had a lot of supporters. He had a lot of voters. He got 3 million fewer votes than Hillary Clinton. That was pretty close, though. I was surprised. I was shocked that he got that many. So there are obviously millions and millions of Americans who voted for him, many of which did so enthusiastically. So I think if you were one of those voters, there were a lot of things this week that you liked. He stuck to a lot of his policy promises, and I use the word policy with Trump loosely. They're not exactly policy positions, more like things that he promised he would do, such as build a border wall along the southern border with Mexico, such as repeal Obamacare completely. Well, actually, he's gone back and forth about whether or not he would repeal it completely. But on his first day, he signed an executive action that sort of starts the process of repealing Obamacare. He addressed the thing that he promised to do about a year ago, which was to ban Muslims from entering the United States. He didn't actually instate a full ban, but he instated an executive order which temporarily banned people from 7 predominantly Muslim countries from traveling to the United States. He banned the whole refugee program for 120 days, and he banned Syrian refugees specifically coming from Syria, indefinitely. So, if you agree with these policy positions, I guess there was a lot to like there for you. You know that Donald Trump was not messing around with what he said he would do during the campaign. Oh, and on the border wall, he also says Mexico is still going to pay for the border wall. Some people thought maybe he might back off that once he was actually in office, take a softer tone. No chance of that. He came out, full throttle on that issue. But I think even for Trump supporters, there was a lot in the first 10 days that you have to raise your eyebrows to and say, I agree. I like the fact that the guy's not PC. I like the fact that he speaks his mind. He's a straight shooter. If you want to call him that, I would say that's not really an accurate representation, but a lot of people feel that way about him. Even so, that's one thing. It's another thing to sort of self-sabotage yourself, to take away from your own political capital when you just don't need to do that. And he did that multiple times this week. Of course, there was the extremely petty fixation and obsession over the inaugural crowd numbers, how many people actually came to his inauguration. He was just obsessed on that and comparing it to Obama's numbers and couldn't believe how the press was reporting on that. And then there was, of course, the voter fraud claim, where he claimed again, even after he's taken office, he just can't help but say it. He says, I would have won the popular vote had not 3 to 5 million illegal votes been cast for Hillary Clinton. Now, this is a claim, of course, that he can't back up. A claim that his own party said was ridiculous. Paul Ryan said there's no evidence of that. Lindsey Graham practically begged him to stop saying it. Not only does he continue to say it sort of in closed-door meetings, the next day when Sean Spicer, the press secretary, was asked about it, Trump says, no, I still believe it. So Spicer has to stand there, and you can almost see in Spicer's face that he knows this is ridiculous. The press is saying, does the president really believe that 3 to 5 million votes were cast illegally? This would be the biggest electoral scandal in American democracy, in American voting history. And Spicer has to stand there and say, yes, this is something the president believes. Now, he could have said, I didn't hear exactly what the president said yesterday. I don't know his exact views on this. I know he's mentioned it in the past, but I can't really comment on it right now. I don't know the specifics. I can check on it. And then they could have consulted, and they could have let this whole thing blow over. But Trump is like, no, you go out there and you tell them that, 3 to 5 million people did vote illegally, because he just can't stand the fact that someone else might have got more votes than he did. He just can't stand the idea that he's not, the most loved person in the United States. That was totally a needless scandal in the first few days that made him look extremely petty, and it's just ridiculous too. Like, even the most ardent conservatives, even people who have been blowing the whistle on voter fraud, even those people do not believe that 3 to 5 million illegal votes were cast for Hillary Clinton. That's just patently absurd. So you had issues like that I think detracted from Trump's first 10 days or so, even though he did a lot of things that he promised to do, a lot of things that his supporters will certainly find popular. Now, if you're like myself and you were to put it mildly, you were skeptical of the wisdom of making Donald Trump president, the wisdom of making Donald Trump commander-in-chief of the world's most powerful military, not just the most powerful military now, the most powerful military ever in the history of Earth. Some of us didn't think that was such a good idea, and if you're like me, I really don't think you saw anything this week to give you a sense of comfort. I don't think you saw anything this week to suggest that President Trump is going to conduct himself in any more stately manner than he did as candidate Trump. There's just too much evidence to the contrary there. So, from my perspective, the main question that I'm asking here today is what is, if we just look at the first 10 days of Trump's presidency, what can we expect? We try to extrapolate out to the next 4 years, which, given the fact that this first 10 days felt like a decade, I don't know if I'm going to be alive by the end of the 4 years if he makes it that far. But if we try to extrapolate out, what does that portend for the American Republic going forward? What is Donald Trump's America going to look like? And honestly, I think it's pretty bad. And I'm not the only person who shares that view. A lot of people, even people who normally are ideologically on the right, they're on the side of Republicans normally. I think even a lot of those people are saying this is, this is scary. The things that he's doing already, the people in the White House, the kind of ideology that they hold, and the evidence early on about how much sway they have in the White House. The fact that Trump still seems to be willing to create international crises, even just needlessly, because he said something in the past. I'm thinking about particularly the border wall and restating and emphasizing the claim that Mexico will pay for the wall. We had a visit planned by Mexican President Peña Nieto. That was canceled because even before the visit, Trump's saying, they're going to pay for the wall. And of course, Nieto is in the position where he has to say, no, we're not going to pay for the wall. He can't he can't, even if he wanted to try to smooth things over with the United States, he lives in a democracy himself. He has to answer to his own constituents there. And he can't say, we're going to pay for the wall, which I wouldn't expect him to anyway. I wouldn't expect any sovereign country to agree to that. But, Trump is supposed to be this master negotiator, and he just totally needlessly started this spat with one of our closest allies when it was totally unnecessary. And Mexico is not going to pay for the wall. And if Trump tries to levy some kind of tariff or some kind of tax on Mexican imports, for example, they're going to hit back at us. Plus, we'll end up paying the cost on that import anyway. All right, I'm going a little bit into the weeds here, but the point I'm trying to make is that Donald Trump is willing to do these things, which are obviously political mistakes from a geopolitical strategy perspective, from a usage of his early political capital in his presidency. From all of these different angles, these were mistakes that everyone would agree these were mistakes. Even if you agree ideologically and you agree morally and you agree legally that the ban on the people entering the United States from the 7 predominantly Muslim countries even if you have no problem with that, just the policy itself, the way that it was implemented was almost universally labeled as a badly bungled rollout, terrible execution. John McCain went on the Sunday shows this past weekend and said that the head of Homeland Security was not even notified about the executive order, that the Justice Department wasn't consulted about the executive order. It was very clear in the early days that immigration officials, TSA officials, had no idea how to interpret the order, much less how to actually execute it. So we had many people who live in the United States as permanent residents, who were just trying to come home from abroad, who were stopped at the airport, put in handcuffs, and taken into rooms for questioning. Some of these people were held for days. Others were held for hours. But even though it didn't affect a huge number of people, just imagine what that would be like. Being a legal resident here in the United States, someone who has a long-term visa or even someone who has a green card, which makes you a permanent resident of the United States. Okay, you have a right to live here for the rest of your life, and you're coming back from one of these countries for whatever reason. You may have been visiting family or on business. You come back and you are detained in your home country at the airport, put in handcuffs, and taken into a room and held for additional examination, additional questioning. I mean, that's a pretty scary thing, and that was like on day 8 or 9 of the Trump presidency. So the fact that they're willing to do things like that, it doesn't look good for what the future holds if you take all this collectively. So I think that's what you have to feel like if you're sort of on the other side, and you never thought that making Donald Trump president was a good idea in the first place. I want to go on another short tangent here for people that are sort of in the middle of this, because I heard a lot of people before the election, people who are intelligent, well-educated, thoughtful people, highly successful. These people are, engaged in broader society. People who, think seriously about questions. But people who are not terribly politically engaged, they don't read political news, on a daily or a weekly basis. They're generally aware of what's going on on the political landscape. But I think for a lot of those people, they sort of thought, well, yeah, Donald Trump, he sort of says non-PC things, and he's probably a little reckless. But, I keep hearing all these bad things about Hillary Clinton, too. I'm not sure there's that much difference between these guys. And now these same people see the election or the reaction to Donald Trump after he's sworn in and after his election, and they see all this, what in their eyes I think is kind of an overreaction to basic politics, that you always have these histrionics surrounding elections. They think, I've seen this story before, there's always this overreaction, and it's probably not much different than it usually is. Well, that's usually a mental shortcut that is actually fairly well-serving. You just sort of assume that this reaction to something is kind of like other reactions that you've seen, and it's not that different. Like, in general, of all the cognitive fallacies out there and sort of the mental shortcuts we make, that's actually a fairly well-serving mental shortcut to make. It's not going to lead you astray as much as some other cognitive shortcuts that we take. However, in this case, it really is different. I just can't overemphasize that enough. I mean, on every level, Donald Trump is unprecedented compared to anyone we've had as president in American history, certainly in recent American history. I mean, maybe the only person I can think of who would have a temperament anywhere in the ballpark of Donald Trump would be maybe Andrew Jackson, who was also an outsider. Although he had a lot of military experience when he was elected. On his last day in office, he is reported to have said that his only regrets were that I didn't get a chance to shoot Henry Clay and I didn't get to hang John C. Calhoun. So kind of tells you a little bit about Andrew Jackson's temperament. But as I said, he's really the only president that I can think of who would be even close to Trump in terms of, not being politically correct. But even so, he had a good deal of military experience. He had a lot of executive experience in that way. Certainly was familiar with thinking strategically. Another thing about Donald Trump that you have to understand, the ideas that he was espousing and the policy promises that he made during the election, and the kind of thinking that he expresses constantly, like, there is no doubt among people who study these things that these are terrible ideas. I mean, it's not really a debatable issue as to whether free trade is a good thing in general. Now, you can say that the United States, when we've made trade deals, these large, like NAFTA, TPP, which Trump already killed right when he came into office. We can debate the merits of that, and I think that was a bad decision. But the idea that the United States shouldn't be engaged in these free trade deals, and that somehow, like, if you have a trade deficit with a country, that means that you're losing and they're winning. That's just fallacious. I mean, that's just wrong. And there's wide agreement among economists that free trade is generally a good thing. Now, you can argue that the United States has done a poor job of retraining people who have lost their jobs because of trade or because of automation. Actually, automation is the biggest driver of lost jobs in the United States, not immigrants coming here, not free trade, which you'll never hear Trump mention those things. But these ideas that he have, they're almost universally considered to be bad ideas by the people who study these things closely. Okay, the border wall. It's going to be really expensive, probably going to cost between $25 and $40 billion. Okay, and experts agree that it's not going to be very effective. I mean, you can get around the wall. First of all, you can go over, around, underneath the wall. So just as a physical barrier, it's not going to be that effective. What do you do in places where the Rio Grande separates? How do you build the wall around that? How do you go over these mountain ranges? And not even to say that the primary source of people coming to the United States illegally is people who come here legally on visas and then overstay their visas. They don't even predominantly come across the southern border anymore. Much less to even say that recently net migration from Mexico has barely been positive. It may have even been negative over the last couple of years. That is to say, more people may have gone from the United States back to Mexico in the last couple of years. So this idea that Mexicans are just streaming across our southern border and that other people are streaming across the southern border and they're killing us and it's this huge disaster, that's a fantasy. I mean, that's just simply not true. The facts don't support that. A lot of his other ideas are just universally considered bad ideas. He keeps repeating this claim, for example, that the United States should have taken the oil when they were in Iraq. Like, there is no debate about this. That would be an international war crime. Yet the president keeps saying that. And he says it, if you watch him say it, he actually thinks that's a good idea. Like, he stood in front of the CIA on the first day of his presidency, and he repeated that claim. And he's looking around the room, and you can just see in his face that he honestly believes that this is a good idea, that, like, the CIA never thought of this. We should have taken their oil while we were there in Iraq. Okay, I'll stop there. But I hope you can see that this guy is so different than anybody we've ever had. I'm just talking about policy questions right now. But if you look at his temperament, his personality, I don't think you can find another person in American public life who deals with reality the way that Donald Trump does, whose sole criteria, seemingly, for determining what is true in the world and also how he interacts with every person that he comes into contact with, the sole criteria for that comes down to one question. Does this make Donald Trump look good? If it does, it's a fact. It happened. It will happen. Doesn't matter what the objective truth is. If that's what he determines, then in his mind, that is a fact. That is the truth. If it makes him look bad, guess what? It didn't happen. Those votes didn't count. Hillary Clinton got illegal votes. That's how she beat me. Just look at the way that Trump talked about the polling numbers throughout the whole campaign season. During the Republican primary, Donald Trump couldn't stop talking about his polling numbers. Every time they went up, he tweeted them out. He bragged about them. He used it to beat his opponents over the head. I mean, he made fun of his opponents during debates about their polling numbers. You know, he constantly did that. He gets into the general election, and the polls show that he's behind Hillary Clinton. And guess what? The polls are rigged. In fact, the whole election might be rigged. I mean, this is the way the guy interacts with reality. The only thing that changed there, it wasn't the polling science. It wasn't the method that pollsters went out and asked people who they were going to vote for, who they supported. All that was basically the same across these two different periods. The only thing that changed was that one set of polls made Donald Trump look good. One of them didn't. So the one that made him look good, guess what? They're real. Everybody should pay attention to them. I'm going to talk about them nonstop. The ones that make me look bad, guess what? They're rigged. They're fake. This is a conspiracy to get you to believe that people don't like me as much as Hillary Clinton. That's impossible. In his mind, this is the way the man interacts with reality. And I mean, if you saw anyone else act like this, you would know that this is absurd. He treats people the same way. Vladimir Putin says something like, I think Donald Trump is a brilliant guy. He didn't actually say that, but Trump thinks he said that. He said something a little bit different. He said that Trump was absolutely the front runner to be president, during the campaign, particularly once he got matched up against Hillary Clinton in the general election. So Trump hears that, and he thinks that Vladimir Putin is praising him. So he's got nothing but nice things to say about Vladimir Putin, of course, because Putin likes me. I like him back. So, you praise him, you get on his team early, and he may just give you a cabinet position. I mean, who knows? If you have the gall to utter a word of criticism against him, no matter how legitimate, even if it's based on his ideas, even if it's based on things that he says, he will lash out at you in a furious rage, and he will personally attack you. He won't attack the substance of what you're saying. He won't try to refute what you're saying. He'll just call you ugly. He'll just call you a loser. He'll just say nobody cares what you have to say and that your ratings suck or something like that. I mean, he basically will just tell you to go F yourself when you present facts to him. And this is, I can give you 100 examples of this, but a couple of the most obvious ones, John McCain. So he's doing this interview with this guy, and Trump has called John McCain a dummy because McCain opposed one of Trump's positions. So the interviewer says, John McCain is a war hero. Do you really want to call him a dummy? He says that to Trump. Instead of Trump taking a moment to consider the situation and perhaps even walk back what he said, or to take the opportunity to say, I probably shouldn't have said dummy, or maybe I shouldn't have used that term. Here's why I disagree with McCain's criticism. He doesn't do that. I've never seen him do that. I'm not exaggerating. I have never seen him do that. Instead, what he says is, John McCain isn't a war hero. John McCain is a war hero because he got captured. I like war heroes who weren't captured, okay? That's what he says about John McCain, about a guy this is a man who spent between 5 and 6 years in a Vietnamese prisoner of war camp, a guy who had an opportunity to leave the prisoner of war camp 2 to 3 years into his captivity there once the Vietnamese learned that he was kind of a big deal, that his dad was a big deal. Instead of leaving, John McCain stays there for an additional 3+ years where he's tortured because they wouldn't let the rest of his men go along with him. And Donald Trump sits there and says he's not a war hero because he was captured. Now, why does he do that? Why would he criticize that guy? Why did he criticize a Gold Star family, a family who had just lost their son in combat in defense of the United States overseas? Why would he criticize them? Why would he say that, oh well, maybe the mother wasn't allowed to speak because it's a Muslim family? Why would he say that about them? Why would he take a shot at a Gold Star family? Because they had the nerve to criticize him. And it doesn't matter how small the criticism, he's going to lash out at you personally. About Carly Fiorina, he tweets out, look at that face. Would anyone vote for that face? That's what he says about a female Republican candidate for president. That's the kind of mentality he has. And this behavior is so absurd. I mean, if you were to observe this kind of behavior, on a day-to-day basis from someone in a leadership position, we would all recognize the absurdity of this and just the basic lack of human decency. I mean, if you went to work tomorrow and your boss calls you in and asks you what you think about some new workplace policy that he or she has instated, and you sort of give some thoughtful criticism, imagine your boss being like, well, you're just a loser anyway. Nobody here likes you. So why don't you either get on board or you're going to be fired? I mean, imagine your boss doing that. Imagine him doing it all the time with everything, where every decision he makes seemingly, and I say seemingly because all the evidence points to this. I can't get inside Donald Trump's mind, but I can certainly observe him and sort of watch the way he makes decisions. And it seems to totally be based around this one criteria. Does it make him look good? Does it make him look bad? But if we saw someone else acting this way, we saw another adult acting this way, we saw our boss handling himself this way at work, we would totally recognize this as being absurd. And we would say this person is not well. I mean, not only is this person a jerk, this person has real psychological problems. And I don't know what it is about Trump. I guess it's the fact that he's successful, or that a lot of people perceive him as being successful. That he sort of has overcome the odds. He did it his way. He didn't use PC language and everybody else was. He never apologized for anything. So we just sort of think that he's going to be able to handle whatever comes his way. And a lot of people are weirdly confident in him despite this behavior, which we would in any other circumstance recognize as totally ridiculous. But the fact that he has been successful in real estate after his dad helped him buy lots and lots of real estate in New York City, in Manhattan, in the 60s and 70s. That's not really, to me, evidence of some business genius. That's not, to me, evidence that he even understands basic economic principles. And certainly the way he interacts with the world is bizarre, to say the very least. Okay, but this isn't just my opinion. This isn't just like some random guy, or some hardcore liberal who is criticizing Donald Trump here. This is something that people on the right recognize, that intellectual, thoughtful, experienced people on the ideological right in the United States are recognizing about Donald Trump in large numbers, that they recognize before his election and after they've observed his behavior in office and his policies in office over his first 10 days, are very, very worried about what this guy means for the future of the United States. I'll give you a few examples here, so you're not just taking the word of some random guy on YouTube. Okay, let's look at Charles Krauthammer, for example. He's a Fox News analyst. He is a nightly guest on Bret Baier's Special Report on Fox, which is actually a fairly serious, unbiased show in the landscape of what Fox offers. But definitely an intellectual guy, very thoughtful. He's Harvard Medical School educated. He's a board-certified psychiatrist. Here's what he had to say a few months ago about Donald Trump, just his personality. He says, "This is beyond narcissism. I used to think that Trump was an 11-year-old, an underdeveloped schoolyard bully. I was off by about 10 years. His needs are more primitive, an infantile hunger for approval and praise, a craving that can never be satisfied. He lives in a cocoon of solipsism where the world outside himself has value. Indeed, it exists only insofar as it sustains and inflates him." And that's so true. And that's what I'm speaking to here, is that the world around Donald Trump, it seems from his point of view, it only exists to inflate his own sense of self-aggrandizement, his own sense of self-glorification. Everything is a means to that end. And I honestly think he ran for president because that was the largest stage in the world for him to be able to try to self-aggrandize, and we sort of have just handed in the keys to the kingdom. Let's talk about Robert Kagan, who is another intellectual on the right. He's been a long-time national security strategist. He served under multiple presidents in that capacity. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Affairs. A very sophisticated thinker, really smart guy. Believe me, he's really, really smart. He is the smartest guy. But really, he is an intellectual. He's a very thoughtful person. He writes a column in the Washington Post. This is what he wrote back in August. "It's not just that he is incapable of empathy. It's not just that he feels he must respond to every criticism he receives by attacking and denigrating the critic, no matter how small or inconsequential the criticism. If you are a Republican, the real problem, and the thing that ought to keep you up nights, is that the man cannot control himself. He cannot hold back even when it is manifestly in his interest to do so. What's more, his psychological pathologies are ultimately self-destructive." This sort of speaks to the same thing, that the guy, he can't help it even when it is so clearly in his self-interest to stop saying these things. I mean, even if you assume that Donald Trump is the ultimate evil genius candidate, and he's only cares about self-serving ends, glorifying himself and enriching himself, or whatever his ultimate goals are, even if you assume the worst about him, you would think that he would be able to avoid behavior that is obviously self-sabotaging, but he can't. Now, I don't know if that is a good thing in the broader scheme of the next 4 years or not, but it's a scary thing to think that the guy is so incapable of just controlling himself on a very basic level. Okay, but these aren't the only people who have had issues with Donald Trump, or who have sounded the warning sirens about him. David Brooks is a conservative columnist for the New York Times. That's not an oxymoron. They do have a conservative columnist. He's a moderate Republican. He was on PBS NewsHour on Friday with Mark Shields. They are on the show every Friday. They give their thoughts on the weekly political events every week. But last week, of course, was sort of a big deal, being Donald Trump's first full week as president. And David Brooks says, this guy strangely seems like a real threat to the American project, to the whole American experiment. That's how seriously he sees the threat of Donald Trump. All right, this is a thoughtful guy. This is not a guy who's prone to knee-jerk reactions. David Frum is a senior editor at The Atlantic. He's a former speechwriter for George W. Bush, a conservative, a very thoughtful guy, an intellectual. He wrote a column in The Atlantic this week talking about how Trump is seemingly trying to establish an autocracy in the United States. That this guy, the things that he's doing, the ideologies he's brought with him here, the way he sees the world, these are very dangerous things, just kind of for the survival of our system as we currently know it. Actually, on the topic of ideology, I know that I mentioned, I don't think that Donald Trump is really motivated by political principles or even some overriding ideology. I think that's true about him, but I haven't even mentioned Steve Bannon yet. Bannon is Trump's chief strategist. He's been on his team from the very start since Trump announced his run for president in 2016. And Bannon really has a dark vision of the world. He was the chief executive at Breitbart when they took kind of a hard right turn a few years ago, started publishing things that were overtly racist and xenophobic. They called Bill Kristol a renegade Jew because he refused to back Donald Trump. So really published some nasty stuff. You can look into that and easily find that on the internet. But this is the guy who is Trump's chief strategist now. The guy has a very dark vision of the world. He sees an existential struggle with Islamism or fundamental Islam, radical Islam. Take your pick of the moniker. If not, really just Islam itself, though. He's a hardcore nationalist by his own accounting. He believes in pulling out of multinational agreements that have, these agreements that have sustained peace for the better part of 50 years in the West and between democracies. He's fiercely against globalization, modernization. He doesn't like free trade at all. Doesn't like immigration, not just illegal immigration. Doesn't like legal immigration either. He dislikes cultural exchange. Wants to return to traditional values. Complains about people from other countries taking jobs here. Openly complained about having people from India and Asia working in tech companies in the United States. Thinks that's a problem. The guy just doesn't like, outsiders coming to this country at all. So I painted Trump sort of as, being out of control, being someone who's emotional, unable to check his emotions, unable to regulate himself on a very basic level, and sort of being an infantile reactionary. And I think that's absolutely true about him. But that doesn't mean that his administration is without direction or without sort of an undertone of ideology. I think Bannon has a very clear vision of what he wants to accomplish, and I think we're already seeing that in the very early days of Trump's presidency, in the early orders and executive actions Trump has signed already. Do you know how many Americans have been killed on U.S. soil by people from the 7 countries that are on the banned list? 0 people have been killed by anyone coming from those countries in the United States. Okay, not a single person. Yet we've been led to believe that there is some kind of huge security crisis here, and that American lives are in the balance. And just get on social media and read around it and read the comment sections of some of your favorite online news outlets and see what people say. I mean, people totally believe that. Okay, they totally believe that like people were hopping on a plane in Aleppo and they were in Cleveland a few hours later, and they were just walking out free and clear into the United States. This is just a total fantasy. That's not true at all. The United States already had one of the most rigorous vetting systems in the world by just about any standard. Practically all of the refugees come here are vetted 18 to 24 months through multiple agencies. The idea that people were just streaming in and they were about to just, any moment, they were just going to set off a bomb or something, total fantasy. There's not a single instance of anybody coming from those countries and killing an American here in the United States. Not a single case. So what was that all about? Why all of a sudden do we have to ban people from these 7 countries? Why do we have to indefinitely ban refugees from Syria? And remember, he did that in the first 7 days. I think that was I think I said earlier, his 8th or 9th day. That was actually on his 7th day in office. He was sworn in last Friday, and it happened the next Friday is when this order was signed. So it's hard to see those things and not see kind of Bannon's ideology coming out already. This attempt to undermine the credibility of the mainstream media, I think, is absolutely intentional. The purpose being to make Trump's followers distrust anything that paints him in a negative light, and to condition them to only trust information that comes directly from the administration, from Trump, and from his own chosen media sources. I think there's evidence that that's already working, and indeed it was working during the election. I mean, there was so much negative coverage of Trump once you got into the general election, and it wasn't like, I don't think that mainstream media was necessarily being unfair to Trump. It's just he stepped in it so many times. I mean, you couldn't avoid it. And if you read any opinion pieces, people who follow politics closely could see that this guy was a total ignoramus on the issue. I mean, he doesn't know anything about anything, and he doesn't care that he doesn't know anything. So, to people who follow politics closely, this is a big deal. Well, Trump supporters, they didn't even see any of that stuff. Like, the New York Times can run front page ads every single day against Trump, and his supporters don't see that. And if they did see it, they would only consider it more evidence that there's some kind of media conspiracy out there against Trump. But this effort to undermine the media, that's totally purposeful. I think it was no accident that they sent Sean Spicer out on the first day ranting and raving about tweets and about this unfair media coverage that Trump was getting. So I think that while Trump himself is not a particularly thoughtful guy, understatement of the year, he does have people around him in his close circle. They do have very clear ideas about what they want to do, and I don't think that most Americans agree with the values that they're expressing, but we're seeing those values being pushed in the early executive actions. Now, there are smart, thoughtful people who disagree with me on this and disagree with the people that I've cited, of course. I was listening to a podcast today, actually, and I heard a Stanford professor of economics, a fellow at the Hoover Institute, say that he's really optimistic about immigration now. He thinks that once a wall goes up, we can sort of look at a more comprehensive immigration package that would make a lot more sense. He actually said that he thinks Trump's heart will eventually be on the right side of the immigration issue. I hear people say things like that, and I want to say I would love to know what you're basing that on. I would love to see what evidence you've seen from Donald Trump that he has any compassion within him, or even any rationality at all. I mean, just show me something that is giving you this confidence that he's going to make good decisions in any way. Now, I hope I'm wrong about that, but I don't see any evidence that the guy is thoughtful or circumspect at all. But lastly, I want to talk about sort of the values that this country has represented over the last 50 years or so. Certainly, I think since the post-Jim Crow era, we've expressed and cultivated values of plurality, inclusiveness, non-discrimination based on race and religion and country of origin, etc. We've sort of expanded that into gay rights, into LGBTQ rights. We were sort of seeing this expanding circle in which we're willing to grant rights and grant the same respects to people who have sort of non-traditional lifestyles, if you want to think of it that way. And I think to a lot of people that, change is scary, and a lot of people don't like that. And I think Trump has sort of latched onto that. But the long view of human history is not a history in which diverse groups of people have lived together in harmony. That's not human history at all. We're learning now how to do that. We're slowly, incrementally, sometimes painfully learning that step by step, but we are learning to do it. We're getting better at it. I don't think there's much doubt about that. But make no mistake, what Trump and his administration are trying to do right now is a hard push in the opposite direction. It is a hard push backward. This is a form of tribalism, this hardcore nationalism, this like cultural purity. And they don't come right out and say that it's based around ethnicity or race, but it's hard to not see that sometimes. It sometimes seems like a very thinly veiled package that is being pushed inside this package. But this hardcore, even if you just believe that there's no racial elements to it at all, or ethnic elements to it at all. This hardcore form of nationalism is a form of tribalism in itself. And if the history of the last 100 years is any indication, it's a particularly dangerous form of tribalism. It absolutely sows the seeds of us against them, winners and losers, givers and takers. And we know that that's the way that Trump sees the world. If you've read any psychological profiles about Trump, I've talked about his impulsivity and his sort of infantile needs, seemingly. But another thing about Trump is that he sees everything as a fight. Everything is a struggle. Everything is combat. And you see him, that's the way he interacts with everybody. But, what's he going to do when some head of a foreign state pushes back against him or criticizes him in public, God forbid? What's he going to do then? We've seen the links that he'll go to double down in the past. These things all worry me. But what kind of values do we want to project both internally within the United States, and what kind of values do we want to project to the rest of the world? And I think I mentioned this earlier, but I'm sort of aiming this whole thing at people in the political middle, political moderates, people who are concerned about the direction of the country, but maybe people who they're not overly partisan, they don't get real involved in politics usually. I think that this is a time where we need vigilance from everybody. I really do believe this is sort of a critical moment in modern American history that we haven't seen in the past, just because this guy is so different. I hope I've convinced you of that. So for the 13 people who might listen to this, and the 4 who are still listening, I think that there are things that can be done. So when Trump pushes policies that don't reflect our commitment to these principles, when he acts in rash and crude ways, when he eschews basic civility, basic principles of good government, when he's trying to rush things, we have to make our voices heard. When he tells us things that for which there is no evidence, when he tries to fearmonger us into believing certain things, when he says things that are demonstrably false, when he flat out lies to our faces, we have to push back. We have to make our voices heard. We can call Congress people. We can ask for specific action. We can ask for them to push against specific actions that Trump's trying to carry out. We can take to the streets if necessary, or as we saw last weekend across the country, people went to airports all over the country to protest, to make their voices heard. We can show the world that Trump doesn't reflect our values and our priorities, and we can signal to populations within the United States that we stand with them. There are a lot of people in this country right now, people who are here legally, people who are citizens here, who feel vulnerable and particularly marginalized at this moment. I live and work around lots of people who would fall into this category, and the feeling is palpable around them. They honestly are scared because they don't know what's going to come next, and that's really a sad thing. That in 2017 we have Americans who feel that way. That's a sad thing. So if we can get out and sort of show solidarity, show support amongst each other, and show people that we don't. We're not down with all of this. You got to remember that 3 million people, roughly, more people voted for the other candidate, who herself was a flawed candidate, over Donald Trump. So, this guy doesn't have a big mandate to go out and start just, bull in a china shop doing anything he wants. So there are things that we can do to push back, and I think that it is absolutely a time for vigilance. So for those 2 of you still listening, thanks for hanging in there. Let's stick together and do what we can to push back when this guy tries to do things that are plainly un-American and unconstitutional.